What is the most creepy, unnerving experience that's ever happened to you? Serious. Part 1. Please like and subscribe to support this channel. Years ago I was buying groceries with my daughter, who was about 18 months old at the time. I see a guy in the checkout ahead of me with two young, toddler, boys, and something seemed off. I can't explain why, but he made my creep alert alarm go off. After checking out he stopped and waited around the entrance. As I leave the store, I pass him, avoid eye contact and go straight to my car. He follows me. I strap my daughter in her car seat and get in and lock the doors. I look around but don't see him anymore. I pull out and start leaving the parking lot and he's behind me. Instead of going home, I turn the opposite direction and he follows me. I don't have a plan or know where I'm going. This is before everyone had a cell phone, and I'm alone with my daughter. I change lanes and he changes lanes to keep behind me. I try to shake him at stoplights. I make U-turns. He's still following me. Finally I get the idea to drive to the police station. When I pull into the parking lot he keeps driving and disappears. I didn't get a plate number but I told the police what had happened and described him. Turns out the description matched a local child predator. Years later, I still wonder about those two little boys he had with him. The summer I was 16 I worked at a movie theater, hated it for many reasons. To this day I can't eat movie theater popcorn. Anyway, it was my turn to take the garbage out and the rule was that two people were supposed to go together, especially at night for safety reasons. Well, the supervisor on duty was not the nicest of people and had me go alone before I clocked out. The dumpster was in the back of the building and there were never a lot of people around. I went into the dumpster enclosure and this guy pops out and says something about how he wasn't there. I told him he need to leave, that only employees were allowed in the area, and he kept coming towards me saying how he wasn't there. He had me keep backing up away from the entrance and I kept talking louder, almost shouting, when another employee came out asking what was taking so long. The guy ran off and I thanked her for coming out. My mom, who happened to work at a police station, picked me up and I told her what happened. She took me to her work and had me talk to an officer who asked me what he looked like. After I described him the best I could, it was dark and all I really remember to this day is his red hat. He had me look at a drawing and asked if he looked like the drawing. He did, and that's when I was told this person is a rapist they are trying to get. I was even more scared and my mom called my work. Evil supervisor got chewed out and the two-person rule was strongly endorsed. I was only there another month after this, thank goodness. When I was about 8 or 10 I was riding my bike with a few friends. We had a bunch of woods and a trail that led to a pond that was well traveled near my house that we were constantly in. Riding one day, I still don't know what happened, but it felt almost like an out-of-body experience where nothing I did mattered. I kept on like a robot for maybe 1 minute all the way through the woods until I suddenly could move again. Told my friends, who believed me, and we turned around. I couldn't speak, move. I just kept on moving and riding even though I wanted to stop. Scary as hell and incredibly creepy. It's been over 20 years since that happened and it's never once happened again. I was about 13 and I had really bad paranoia. I would tell my parents and friends about it, but friends laughed at me and my parents thought I was just being a pussy. One day I was home alone, and whenever I was home alone I heard footsteps coming from downstairs. I knew it was in my head, so I tried to keep it in the back of my head. One day though I heard footsteps walking around at the bottom of the stairs. My room is at the top of the stairs. So I knew that this time the footsteps were closer and there was only a flight of stairs between me and these footsteps. I slowly walk over to my window and open it just in case I have to jump out or something. I couldn't even lock the door because my parents kept my bedroom door key. It was at this point where all I heard was footsteps slowly making their way up the stairs and I started to shit myself. I'm standing on the outside window ledge ready to jump, and then I see my door handle start to turn. I noped out of there so fast. Fell from the second-story window and sprained my ankle, but still kept on running and then jumped over a fence. I call my dad and he says he will be home in half an hour, so I wait behind the fence until he comes home and scope the house out. Few years later, and seeing a therapist only to realize I have mild symptoms of schizophrenia. Loads of similar stuff has happened and now I finally have an understanding of why it's happening, but before I was diagnosed you best believed I was freaked out. Wife and I were eating at a restaurant when two men came in and just sat by the entrance. One was wearing what looked like construction-type clothes, and the other was dressed very dapper. We got up to leave, and as soon as we walked by, the nicely dressed man followed right behind and then just stood outside of the entrance to the restaurant. We got in my car and drove to the grocery store that was in the same parking lot. When we got out, that man was standing right in front of the entrance of the grocery store, and talking on the phone. At this point we were aware that something was up, so I told my wife to stay in the store while I grabbed the car. She said no, as she didn't want to be alone, so when we walked out we locked arms. The guy was gone, but when we approached my car, both the dapper man and the construction man had pulled their car a row behind mine and both were standing halfway out with the doors open and car running staring at us. I walked my wife to the passenger side, then stared at them as I walked around the back and pulled my shirt over my pistol so that they could see it, concealed carry permit. They did, and immediately shut their doors and backed out. We called the police to tell them what had happened and they sent out a unit to patrol the parking lot for a few days. It might seem like an overreaction to some, but at the time we lived in the sex trafficking capital of America. I was hiking in the PNW. Got water from a stream when someone starts throwing rocks. Not really at me but over my head. A shot across the bow. I thought it was someone being a dick and yelled for them to stop. Next thing I know a huge rock comes flying out at me, almost hitting me. Must have been at least 200 pounds. I tried to pick it up. I was going to throw it back, and couldn't even budge it. I had spent that summer hauling 75 pounds bags of cement so I wasn't no weakling. People always tell me it was an avalanche but no way. Came from flat ground and the trajectory was all wrong. I hauled ass out of there. I was hanging out with some rather new acquaintances, friends of friends. One of them, I'll call him Bob, was being kind of pushy about wanting to have sex. Which I thought was odd because I'd literally just met him, but whatever, it was a rowdy group. We were in an apartment I shared with 3 roommates. One thing and another and all the roommates and other people had gone somewhere, and it was just me and Bob left. I don't quite remember the context. I think I said something about my feet being sore. Bob picked me up, like off the ground, over his shoulder, while I was telling him not to. Really freaked me out. I yelled very loud. No one was in my apartment but it was a dense complex and I'm sure the neighbors probably heard. No one came but I think the loudness startled him and he put me down and left. Never saw him again. I think he was just joking around and would probably not have raped me or anything, but it's seriously unnerving. I'm pretty short and small and he was a big guy, and it was such an icky, helpless feeling. I've got plenty but this one haunts me. One time when I was back from school in NY and staying at my mom's for the summer, I had taken the train home in broad daylight back to Mama's place. I was right in front of my house on a busy street most days, but today there was no one in sight, when a dinky 2-door sedan pulls up right next to me. He gets out and tells me to get in his car. He says he's new in town and wants a tour. I said that I'm just going home and had prior engagements. He repeats the same, "Get in my car," line. He wasn't taking no for an answer. I started backing away, he took a step forward. I then sprint full speed into my neighbor's yard who I never talked to, vault over their brick wall, and hop into their yard. I peek and wait for him to leave. As soon as he goes I jump back over and run full speed into my house and my mom is sitting there knitting. I say nothing except, "Can you help me pay for car insurance while I'm back in town for a while?" She says sure. I couldn't stop thinking about how that guy generally knows where I live for like the entire summer. Luckily my mom let me use her car for a while so the amount I was outside between my mom's and the car was reduced. The morning after my dad had died, there was just this unexplainable eerie vibe. I kept convincing myself he was just in a really deep sleep, but then hours had passed and he hadn't moved or made a sound at all. Still, I was just being paranoid, right? It had just been me and him for years so of course I was scared to lose him. So I made him a coffee, set it down, psyched myself up to go in there and wake my dad. I tapped him on the back and the whole bed shook because his body was already in rigor mortis. Now I know where the term, dead weight, comes from. Also, while on the phone to paramedics, they had me turn him over to do chest compressions. At this point I was in shock and had no understanding that he had already been gone a couple hours. So I turned him over and his arm was so rigid it just stood directly upward, like reaching out at nothing. One side of him was kind of a blue color. That time I sat with him before his body was taken away. I kept having horrid intrusive thoughts about things like what if a bug just crawled out of his open mouth. Thankfully it didn't. But fuck, never ever will forget the fear and shock that day. My poor old dad. I'm just glad I was home that night. I wish I'd known he had been so sick. When I was about 14 I was walking on the sidewalk when I passed an old man dressed in what looked like monk robes. Although they didn't seem to belong to any religion that I knew, e.g. Buddhist, Taoist monks. As I passed him he suddenly tapped me and said, "Tell you the future." I instinctively dismissed him and said, "No thanks," but right as I took a step to walk off he grabbed my forearm really hard and yanked me back and started getting agitated shouting, "Big disaster coming for you." I'm not shaken by it anymore and in all likelihood it may have been a crazy person, but I still recall the incident from time to time and get confused all over again. When I was around 6, one of my friend's brother died, and when we visited the wake, I smelt something odd when I went closer to his coffin. It was like the smell of a dead person. Probably 2 weeks after, that friend and some of our other friends played in my house and all of a sudden I smelt that same smell. Then she, the friend, said, "I can smell my brother's coffin." I got shocked. Next thing I know, she and her other sister went to the corner of my house for like 2 minutes because ACC to them, their brother was there. They talked in the corner like he was really there. 19 years later, I still get creeped out when I pass by that corner in the house. It's not creepy per se, but definitely unnerved me. It was while I was on summer vacation before freshman year of college. I was eating dinner outside with my family at this restaurant when this girl came over. She was no older than 16 and was very nervous. Like kept looking at the ground, picking at her hands, kind of nervous. She introduces herself, I'll call her Roxy, and immediately begins to apologize. She'd been staring at us on and off for the duration of dinner, so we think that's all this is about. But then she says, "I don't normally do this, but I'm having a tough time ignoring the energy around this table." She explains that she is able to perceive spirits and will sometimes help them communicate with the living if they've got something important to say. Now, my parents and I are skeptical. My mom and I more so than my dad, but not by much. We don't for a second buy what she's saying, but we don't dismiss her because whether we believe it or not, she definitely does, and it was causing her discomfort. Had she been an adult we'd have waved her away, but she was a teenage girl who'd been out with friends for a birthday dinner, so we rolled our eyes but let her do her bit. I can't remember how it started off since I wasn't paying attention. We answered the question she asked, making sure that everything is vague and non-committal. Not false, but we weren't going to give her anything to work with. She says the spirit was an older person when they died, probably a man, then looks at all three of us. She focuses on my mom and states that she thinks it's her father. That his passing wasn't recent, but it wasn't all that long ago either. Now, we thought that she just overheard us commenting on the fact that it was almost 2 years since my grandfather passed away. She says she's going to connect with the spirit to better understand what's causing the disturbance. She starts wheezing, and it takes her a bit to catch her breath. Says that it feels like he's drowning, but the water is spilling out from the inside. My grandfather passed from pneumonia, so that tracks. We didn't bring that up over dinner, so now we're a bit invested and certainly put off. She continues and asks a few more questions before stopping mid-sentence. After a pause she turns to my mom and rattles off a string of numbers. She says it's the same date in 2 different years and that it would mean something to my mom. Says that death has a flair for repetition. I'm a bit confused, but my mom is just kind of frozen. My mom reminds me that her brother died on the same day as my grandfather around 20 years before. Which is the date that Roxy just said. Roxy didn't stop there. She says that she feels another presence there, but it won't go near my grandfather because it's angry. Without missing a beat she turns to me and says, "You wear his name well, it suits you," and that I had a similar energy to the second presence. This also tracks. My grandfather was not the best to my uncle while he was alive, and I am named after my uncle. Now my eyes are about ready to pop out of my skull. She then asks if she can ask me another question and I can do nothing but nod. She leans in and whispers, "Do your parents know that you're gay, and are they okay with it?" I am shocked but I nod. She turns back the 3 of us and continues. Goes on about the spirit showing a rainbow to her and that the spirit wanted us to know that he was proud of me and that had my grandfather been alive when I came out he'd have been nothing but supportive. This is also significant because my uncle was gay and that was big point of contention for my grandfather. She says that my uncle is glad that I got the love and support from my parents that he never did. Roxy turns to my dad and just says that the spirit is sorry for how he treated my dad in the beginning. That he couldn't have asked for a better son-in-law. He'd apparently been an ass to my dad when my parents first started dating. Finally Roxy turns to my mom, says that my grandfather is sorry that he wasn't always the best role model when it came to relationships but that he loved her and he could have been happier to have been her dad. She then thanks us for hearing her out, hopes that provided closure, and that she was sorry for taking our time. She walks off to her friends and the three us just kinda sit there. We spent the rest of the night replaying our time on the restaurant patio trying to see if we'd said anything before or during our conversation with Roxy that could have given her information to work with. Like sure, if she knew our names she could have googled some of that information. And while I don't scream gay, I don't make an effort to hide it, so she could have just made an educated guess. But there were some things that she brought up that she should have known, things that were never recorded that happened 2 decades ago. It was a lot. I try not to think about this encounter too much because I start to question my worldview to an uncomfortable degree. This was an unnerving experience for both me and my parents, but by no means was it a bad one. We appreciate what Roxy did, even if we don't fully understand it. If nothing, it makes for an interesting story. So Roxy, if you ever read this, thank you. Mom dated a guy, they broke up because he was an asshole. Dad was getting married, was friendly with asshole X, invited him to the wedding. My mom wasn't going to go, long travel, until she found out my dad invited him. I was the ring bearer, and when I walked down the aisle with the rings the asshole X jumps into the aisle on his knees. I was a distance away from him, he didn't jump at me but just wanted to make a scene, and says he will always care about me or something to that effect. I'm a guy, he never abused me, my mom would have had him put in jail 100%, but he was so creepily attached. She ended up getting a restraining order at some point or another, and then I didn't think about this story for more than a decade until I read your question. My dad is also clearly an asshole in this scenario, but I think he didn't understand how creepy this guy was until then. Which of course was the only time it affected him. When I was in high school, 10th and 11th grade, I babysat for a neighbor. Basically, the dad, late 40s, showed increasingly uncomfortable, slightly stalkerish behavior. This was early 2000s. It started small. Dragged the 15-second drive back to my house out to 5 minutes. Asked me if I had a boyfriend. When I said no he said, "Are they crazy? If I was 15 I would jump on that." One time I fell asleep on the couch after the kids fell asleep. He woke me up and his face was 6 inches from my face. Then things got real weird. He told me to watch TV in the master bedroom after the kids went to bed, in case the kids had nightmares. But his wife's lingerie and a vibrator were left out on the dresser. That's when I quit babysitting and got a job in fast food. But he just found new excuses to talk to me. He'd ask me to babysit, and I was so glad to have, "No, I'm working," as an excuse. But then he'd show up at my restaurant and try to hang out and talk to me. While waiting for the school bus, he stopped and tried to convince me to get in his car for a solid couple minutes, with the school bus waiting right behind him and me pleading him to just go. Eventually I started driving myself to school. I started catching him stopped in his car in front of my house, with the window down, in the middle of winter, staring at my house. He'd wait for a minute or two and then drive on. It scared the crap out of me, and it happened often. I got in the habit of peeking out the windows and looking up the street before walking to my car. Sadly, it took me years to have the guts to tell my parents. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. When I finally did, my mom admitted that he creeps her out too. Long story short, we were driving a 25-year-old old car down a mountain road in a thunderstorm when we passed ourselves going in the opposite direction. The chances of someone having that exact model car with the same mismatched door are as close to zero as you can get. We couldn't immediately turn around because it was a winding mountain road in horrible weather conditions, but we did so as quickly as possible, then sped back up the mountain looking for the other car. We never found it, so I can only assume it was actually us from another timeline. I'll elaborate if you're curious. To set the stage, I lived in a rented home with my mother and brother. We had moved in about a month earlier and all of us hadn't really enjoyed the transition from our last house. This house was always cold, and the water took a long time to get hot. The walls and floors creaked and the doors were difficult to open and close properly. I thought it was terrible, but I was only 10, so what the hell do I know, right? We first noticed that our living room furniture would sometimes be out of place, especially one of our love seats. For whatever reason, sometimes in the morning or after we got back from the store or school, it would be moved a few feet out away from the wall, making it immediately noticeable as we re-entered the house. Also, the blinds in the master bedroom would never stay the way you left them. If you closed them, then when you got back they were open, and vice versa. About a month into living here, the doorknob for the door that separated our living room from the entryway had the little tightening screw fall out, making it really easy to accidentally pull one side of the doorknob off as you're trying to open the door. The main event. A few days before, the entryway light bulb went out and needed to be replaced, but as it was about 10 feet in the air, my mother and brother didn't feel like replacing it as they were both pretty busy most of the time. Now my friends and I loved hanging out in my living room on the weekends as we would have the whole house to ourselves. So, on this particular Saturday, we were sitting around my dining room table playing a game when we all hear the doorknob on the outside of the living room entryway door fall off and hit the floor. This had happened a couple of times at this point, so I wasn't initially scared in any way. I sigh and explain what the noise was to my friends as I walk across the living room and carefully open the entryway door. I go to turn on the light switch and remember that the bulb needed to be replaced. So I kneel down and start to feel around for the doorknob. I fumble around in the dark for a few minutes. At this point, I think that the damn knob has rolled down the hall or something and I need a flashlight. So I get up and walk back into the living room, explaining to my friends what I am doing, and walk into the kitchen, where the flashlight normally is. As I walk into the kitchen, the miscellaneous stuff drawer, the kind every kitchen has, is open, and sitting next to the flashlight is the doorknob. To this day I still get the tingling feeling down my spine as I write this. As I stare down at the drawer in disbelief, I notice I am shaking and sweating uncontrollably. I am barely able to stand, as I stumble back into the living room. And with great difficulty, I explain to my friends what just happened. Needless to say, they all lost their collective shits and we got the hell out of that house. TL. Dr. Something moved a doorknob 30 plus FT through multiple solid walls, and opened a drawer. When I was a teenager I worked as a cashier. The owner's son also worked there and always gave me a bad feeling. He was probably 40s and was the type who only worked there because he was the owner's son. One night before closing he let all the other employees leave and had me check out the last few customers. I realized that it was just me and him left and every part of me was screaming, "Get out." I actually considered asking the last person I was checking out to stay with me, but figured that would be weird. After they left, this guy locks the door and asks me to take the cash drawer to the back room, which had blacked out windows, meaning no one else would even know I was in there. At this point I was freaking out and "get out" was even louder in my head, so I told him I was sorry, but I was late for a dinner party at my parents' and they were expecting me. I grabbed my purse and got out of there as quickly as possible. I used to keep my purse in the back room until this other woman I worked with showed me how to hide it under the register. I'm thankful for her to this day and have always wondered what would have happened if my purse was back there. I quit soon after because I never felt comfortable working there again. When I was 14, I began experiencing what is known as head explosions. This is a strange condition in which people will hear a loud explosion-like sound while sleeping, causing them to shoot awake in a panic. To me, it sounds a lot like a loud object banging into the side of shipping container. Well, the staircase in my house when I was 14 was directly adjacent to my room, on the far side, and at the bottom was a large dresser for shoes. The first night I experienced an explosion, I believed that one of my parents had fallen down the stairs and slammed into the dresser. I shot up and ran into the hall, staring into the darkness at nothing. I went upstairs and saw both my parents asleep. They slept with the door open, and I returned to bed. Sometime after I fell back asleep I heard the sound again. This time I ran out faster, saw nothing, but started calling out to my parents. They didn't respond, and I was actually too freaked out to go up the stairs. This continued 2 more times, and by the last one I had my head under the sheets because I truly believed my house was haunted. This happened periodically, and I just went on believing my house was haunted. I told my parents, told other people, and mostly it was met with skepticism or flat-out dismissal. As an adult, about 20 or so, I had my first explosion since out of that house. It was then that I began thinking there was just something wrong with me. A little research later and I discover a lot of people experience it. I was actually quite irritated, because I would continuously speak to my parents about what I was hearing, but they never even bothered to look into it themselves. At least the house wasn't actually haunted. In the 7th grade, it was probably my worst school year ever, but anyways, a kid in my grade had killed a 92-year-old blind woman he was robbing from. He wasn't going to the school at the time, but the day he was arrested he took a tour of the school. I will never forget his cold look on his face. It was scary, even before we found out he murdered the woman. I was 12 and so was he. I wasn't really friends with him, but in the 6th grade, we had sat next to each other all year in science. I guess I'll never forget it. It's just so hard for me to fathom that I had conversations with a murderer. Now he will be in jail until he is like 25. Unnerving? I was cutting shrubs and deadwood maybe 250 yards downhill from my house, in the woods. I had a hard hat with ear protectors on when I was stung on the back of my head. I made a big mistake and pulled the hard hat from my head and realized I was being swarmed by yellow jackets. I panicked and took off running uphill to my house. I got to the edge of the woods, tripped and fell down. I was still being stung, so I got back up and began running again. Another 50 yards and fell down again. They were still there. Almost made it to the house and fell again. I'm 74 years old and was in full panic mode. I made it into the entry, closed the door and waited. Nothing. Phew. Went into the house and 2 of the bastards were suddenly there. I ran into the bathroom and another appeared. I shut the door and ran upstairs to my bedroom. 2 more goddamned yellow jackets. I went to another room and finally was safe. Except now I realized my chainsaw and hard hat were in the woods and so were my only eyeglasses, worth $700. Third try I found them with binoculars. I have never felt true panic in my life till then. Yes, I was unnerved. My mom has been into heroin most of my life, and when I was 6 I was put into state custody. In my state there is a soft restraining order put onto parents when their children are taken from them. She used to wait outside my school, and when I would walk home she would follow me and try to talk to me from across the street through the neighborhood. I was always scared to talk to her because I thought she would get into trouble if I acknowledged her. She wanted me to get in her car and run to a different state with her. This went on for weeks. I was always scared and didn't know what to do. Still scarred to this day 20 years later. Was having a sleepover with my friend the summer between 8th and 9th grade. She was going into 11th grade and had a car and a license. That night her parents took her car keys away, so in a fit of rage she locked us in her room to sleep so her mom couldn't wake us up in the morning. Around 3 a.m. she got a phone call. It was from a friend working overnight stocking shelves and he wasn't going to be out of work till 5. When we woke up we realized how extremely hot it was in her room, so we opened the window directly above my head. I was sleeping on the floor, and right next to the head of her bed and stripped down to our underwear. We drifted off for another 30 minutes until we heard her dad screaming, "Get the fuck out of here," on the top of his lungs. The house was shaking and he was in the room directly below us. My friend and I both woke up, paralyzed in fear, while her mom anxiously tried to open her locked bedroom door to make sure we were okay. Turns out, someone had grabbed the ladder resting against their garage and was climbing up into her window where we were sleeping, and was jerking off to us. Her dad is an extremely light sleeper and heard the top of the ladder scrape against the window panes.